The deep oxblood curtain fell over the stage. The dancers waved their hands so vigorously, the whole row became a blur of movement, with individual figures impossible to make out. Though the applause was loud, with even the odd shout of "bravo" thrown in here and there was no curtain call. The ovation abruptly subsided, and the audience began to gather up their bags and jackets and make their way to the aisles. He uncrossed his legs and stood up. He'd kept his arms folded during the 5 or so minutes of applause, silently gazing up at the dancers' eager faces as they greedily drank it in. Their efforts had inspired in him both compassion and respect, but the choreographer, he felt, hadn't deserved his applause. He exited the auditorium and crossed the foyer, studying the now obsolete performance posters. He'd been in a bookshop in the city center when he'd happened upon one of the posters, the sight of which had sent a shiver through his body. Worried that he might have missed the last performance, he'd hurriedly phoned the theater and made a reservation. On the poster, men and women sat displaying their naked backs, which were covered from the napes of their necks right down to their bottoms with flowers, coiling stems, and thickly overlapping petals, painted on in red and blue. Looking at them, he felt afraid, excited, and somehow oppressed. He couldn't believe that the image that had obsessed him for almost a year now had also been dreamed up by someone else, the choreographer. Someone, moreover, whom he'd never even heard of. Was that image really about to unfold in front of him, just as he dreamed it? Sitting in his seat, waiting for the lights to go down and the performance to start, he'd been so nervous he couldn't even take a sip of water. But he hadn't found what he'd been looking for. Threading his way through the crowds of theater-goers who had thronged into the foyer, and who all looked so dazzling and extroverted, he headed for the exit nearest to the underground station. There had been nothing for him in the booming electronic music, the gaudy costumes, the showy nudity, or the overtly sexual gestures. The thing he'd been searching for was something quieter, deeper, more private. He had to wait a while for a train, it being a Sunday afternoon, and when he got on, he stood near the carriage door, holding a program with the photograph from the posters printed on its cover. His wife and 5-year-old son were waiting at home. His wife, he knew, would have liked for them to spend weekends together as a family, but all the same, he'd set aside a half day to see the performance. Would he get anything out of it? He'd known that, more than likely, he would only end up disillusioned yet again. That in the end, it was the only possible outcome. And now that was exactly what had happened. How on earth could a complete stranger be expected to tease out the inner logic of something he himself had dreamed up, to find a way to make it come alive? The bitterness that suddenly welled up inside him was exactly the same as the feeling he'd experienced a long time ago, on watching a video work by the Japanese artist Yayoi. The work had been filled with scenes of promiscuous sexual practices, featuring around 10 men and women, each of them daubed all over with colored paint, their greed for each other's bodies playing out against a background of psychedelic music. They never stopped moving the whole time, flailing and floundering like fish out of water. Not that his own thirst was any less strong, of course, only he didn't want to express it like that. Anything but that. After a while, the train went past the apartment complex where he lived. He'd never had any intention of getting off there. He stuffed the program into his backpack, rammed both fists into the pockets of his sweater, and studied the interior of the carriage as it was reflected in the window. He had to force himself to accept that the middle-aged man, who had a baseball cap concealing his receding hairline and a baggy sweater at least attempting to do the same for his paunch, was himself. As luck would have it, the door to the studio was locked, which meant he had the place to himself. Sunday afternoons were practically the only times when he could use the space undisturbed. It was a small studio on the second floor below ground level of K Group's headquarters, provided as part of their corporate sponsorship drive. The 4 video artists who shared the space had to take it in turns to use the single computer. He was grateful to be able to use the overhead equipment free of charge, but his sensitivity to the presence of others, which meant that he could only become properly absorbed in his work when he was alone, was a major stumbling block. The door opened with a small click. He groped along the wall until he found the light switch. Making sure to lock the door behind him first of all, he took off his cap and sweater, put his bag down on the floor, then proceeded to pace up and down the narrow studio corridor for a while, his hands over his mouth, before finally slumping down in front of the computer and putting his head in his hands. He opened his bag and got out the program, his sketchbook, and master tape. On that tape, which was labeled with his name, address, and phone number, were the originals of every video work he'd made over the past 10 years or so. It had already been 2 years since he'd last stored a new work on the tape. Not that 2 years was considered terminal as far as fallow periods went, but it was still long enough to make him anxious. He opened the sketchbook. The drawings filled scores of pages, and, despite being based on fundamentally the same idea, were completely different from the performance poster in terms of atmosphere and artistic feel. The naked bodies of the men and women were brilliantly decorated, covered all over in painted flowers. And there was something simple and straightforward about the ways in which they were having sex. Without the taut buttocks, tensed inner thighs, and the skinny upper bodies that gave them a dancer's physique, there would have been no more suggestiveness about them than there was with spring flowers. Their bodies, he hadn't drawn in faces, had a stillness and solidity that counterbalanced the arousing nature of the situation. The image had come to him in a flash of inspiration. It had happened last winter, when he'd started to believe that he might somehow be able to bring his 2-year-long follow period to an end, when he'd felt energy start to wriggle up from the pit of his stomach, bit by bit. But how could he have known this energy would coalesce into such a preposterous image? For one thing, up until then, his work had always tended toward realism. And so, for someone who had previously worked on 3D graphics of people worn down by the vicissitudes of late capitalist society, to be screened as factual documentaries, the carnality, the pure sensuality of this image was nothing short of monstrous. And the image might never have come to him if it hadn't been for a chance conversation. Had his wife not asked him to give their son a bath that Sunday afternoon? Had he not watched her helping their son to pull on his underpants after toweling him dry and been moved to exclaim, "That Mongolian mark is still so big, when on earth do they fade away?" Had she not replied thoughtlessly, "Well, I can't remember exactly when mine went, and Yeong-hye still had hers when she was 20. If she hadn't then followed up his astonished 20 with, just a thumb-sized thing, blue. And if she had it that long, who knows, maybe she's still got it now." In precisely that moment, he was struck by the image of a blue flower on a woman's buttocks, its petals opening outward. In his mind, the fact that his sister-in-law still had a Mongolian mark on her buttocks became inexplicably bound up with the image of men and women having sex, their naked bodies completely covered with painted flowers. The causality linking these two things was so clear, so obvious as to be somehow beyond comprehension, and thus it became etched into his mind. Though her face was missing, the woman in his sketch was undoubtedly his sister-in-law. No, it had to be her. He'd imagined what her naked body must look like and began to draw, finishing it off with a dot like a small blue petal in the middle of her buttocks, and he'd got an erection. It was almost the first time since his marriage, and definitely the first time since he'd said goodbye to his mid-30s, that he'd felt such intense sexual desire, a desire which, moreover, was focused on a clear object. And so who was the faceless man with his arms around her neck, looking as if he were attempting to throttle her, who was thrusting himself into her? He knew that it was himself, that, in fact, it could be none other. Arriving at this conclusion, he grimaced. He spent a long time searching for a solution, for a way to free himself from the hold this image had on him, but nothing else would do as a substitute. Another image as intense and enticing as this one simply didn't exist. There was no other work he wanted to do. Every exhibition, film, performance came to feel dull and flat, for no other reason than that it wasn't this. He spent hours seemingly lost in a daydream, like mulling over how to make the image become a reality. He would rent a studio from his painter friend and install lighting, get some body paints and a white sheet to cover the floor. He let his thoughts run on like this, even though the most important thing, persuading his sister-in-law, still remained to be done. He agonized for a long time over whether he might be able to replace her with another woman. When the suspicion occurred to him, somewhat belatedly, that the film he was planning could all too easily be categorized as pornography. Never mind his sister-in-law, no woman would agree to such a thing. In that case, should he shell out a large sum of money to hire a professional actress? Even if, after making 100 concessions, he eventually managed to get the thing filmed, would he really be able to exhibit it? He'd often anticipated that his work, which dealt with social issues, might put him in the firing line with some people. But never before had he imagined himself being branded as some peddler of cheap titillation. He'd always been completely unrestricted when it came to making his art, and so it hadn't ever really occurred to him that this freedom might become a luxury. If it hadn't been for the image, he would never have had to go through all this anxiety, this discomfort and unease, this agonizing doubt and self-examination. He wouldn't have had to suffer the fear of losing everything he'd achieved, not that that really amounted to all that much, even his family in one fell swoop, and due to a choice that he himself had made. He was becoming divided against himself. Was he a normal human being? More than that, a moral human being? A strong human being, able to control his own impulses? In the end, he found himself unable to claim with any certainty that he knew the answers to these questions, though he'd been so sure before. He heard the click of keys in the lock, quickly covered the sketchbook, and turned to face the door. Whoever it was, he didn't want his drawings to catch his or her eye. This was something new and a little strange for him. He never usually held back when it came to showing his sketches or concepts to other people. "Hey." It was Jay, his long hair tied back in a ponytail. "I didn't think there was anyone in here." He leaned back, keeping his movements deliberately slow, and laughed. "Fancy a cup of coffee?" Jay asked, fishing some coins out of his pocket. He shook his head. While Jay went to get a coffee from the vending machine, he looked around the studio. Now, no longer his own private space. He put his baseball cap back on, uncomfortable at the thought of his balding crown being on show. Like a cough that tickles the throat, he could feel a long suppressed yell threatening to burst out from deep inside him. He swept his things into his bag and fled the studio, hurrying toward the lift. In his reflection in the lift's door, which gleamed like a mirror, it looked as though tears were streaming from his bloodshot eyes. However much he combed his memory, he couldn't recall anything like this having happened to him before. Right at that moment, he wanted nothing more than to spit at those red, lined eyes. He wanted to pummel his cheeks until the blood showed through beneath his black beard, and smash his ugly lips, swollen with desire, with the sole of his shoe. "You're late," his wife said, making an effort not to sound too put out. Their son turned back to the plastic forklift truck he'd been playing with. It was impossible to tell whether or not he was glad to see his father. Since his wife had gone back to working full-time at her cosmetics store, she was constantly exhausted, but she was the type to press on regardless, diligent and persevering. Practically the only thing she asked of him was to keep Sunday daytimes free. "I'd like to have a bit of a rest myself, and our son needs to spend time with his father too, doesn't he?" He knew that this was the only time of the week she would allow herself a bit of a break. She was even grateful that he let her take on so much responsibility, running a business as well as a household, without so much as a word of complaint. But these days, every time he looked at her, he saw her sister's face overlaid on hers, and their domestic life couldn't have been further from his thoughts. "Have you had dinner?" "Yeah, I grabbed something on the way." "You have to eat properly. Why do you always just grab something on the go?" Her tone was resigned, as though she'd long given her husband up as a lost cause. He examined her exhausted-looking face the way one might look at a complete stranger. Her eyes were deep and clear, framed by naturally double eyelids, and her face was a slender oval with a smooth, feminine jawline. The success of the cosmetics store, which had expanded over the years from the 2.5 pyong space which she'd somehow managed to set up when she was still a young girl, must have been largely down to the impression of affability which these pleasant, open features gave. And yet, right from the first, there'd been something about her that left him feeling vaguely dissatisfied. Her face, figure, and thoughtful nature all combined to form the spitting image of the woman he'd spent so long trying to find. And so, unable to put his finger on just what it was that he felt she was lacking, he'd made up his mind to marry her. In fact, it was only when he was introduced to her sister that he realized what it was his new wife was missing. Everything about her sister pleased him. Her single-lidded eyes, the way she spoke, so blunt as to be almost uncouth, and without his wife's faintly nasal inflection, her drab clothes, her androgynously protruding cheekbones. She might well be called ugly in comparison with his wife, but to him she radiated energy, like a tree that grows in the wilderness, denuded and solitary. All the same, he felt no different toward her than he had before they'd met. Now she's my type. Even though they're sisters, and they're quite similar in many ways, there's some subtle difference between them. This thought flitted briefly through his mind, and was gone. Shall I make you something to eat or not? His wife's question was almost a demand. I told you, I've already eaten. Exhausted from all the emotions roiling inside him, he opened the bathroom door. As soon as he turned the light on, his wife's voice drilled into his ears once more. On top of everything else, I'm worried about Yeong-hye. I didn't hear from you all day, and Jiwoo has a cold, so I had to stay with him all the time. Her sigh was followed by a shout directed at their son. What are you doing? I told you to come and take your medicine. Knowing that the boy would dawdle, his wife slowly poured the powdered medicine onto a spoon and mixed it with a strawberry-colored syrup. He emerged from the bathroom and closed the door behind him. What about your sister? He asked his wife. What's happened now? She finally got served with the divorce papers, of course. It's not that I don't understand Mr. Chung's position, but all the same, he could have shown a bit more sympathy. To just throw away a marriage like that? He stammered. Shall I call around and see her? His wife suddenly became animated. Would you? We haven't had her around in such a long time, and if you were to go and see her, even if it's a bit awkward, but you know, it's not as though she doesn't understand the difficulty. She knows that's just how things turned out. He studied his wife, a picture of responsible compassion as she carefully approached their son with the medicine. She's a good woman, he thought. The kind of woman whose goodness is oppressive. I'll give her a call tomorrow. Do you need the number? No, I've got it. Feeling as though his chest might be about to burst, he went back inside the bathroom and closed the door. He turned on the shower and listened to the water drumming down into the bathtub as he took off his clothes. He was aware that he hadn't had sex with his wife for close on 2 months. But he also knew that his penis's sudden rigidity was nothing to do with her. He'd pictured to himself his sister-in-law's rented studio apartment, the one she'd shared with his wife back when they were young, pictured her curled up there on the bed, then switched to remembering how it had felt to carry her on his back, her body pressed up against his and staining his clothes with her blood, the feel of her chest and buttocks, imagined himself pulling down her trousers just enough to reveal the blue brand of the Mongolian mark. He stood there and masturbated. A moan escaped from between his lips, not quite laughter and not quite a sob. The shock of the too cold water. It had been the beginning of summer, 2 years ago, when his sister-in-law had cut her wrist open in his house. They'd moved there only recently, wanting the extra floor space, and his wife's family had all come around for lunch. He'd heard about his sister-in-law apparently turning vegetarian, something that hadn't sat at all well with this family of meat lovers. The father in particular. She'd been so pitifully thin, it wasn't as though he couldn't understand them giving her a strict dressing down. But that her father, the Vietnam War hero, had actually struck his rebellious daughter in the face and physically forced a lump of meat into her mouth. That was something else. However much he thought back on it, he couldn't convince himself that it had actually happened. It was more like a scene from some bizarre play. More vivid and frightening than any other was the memory of the scream that had erupted from his sister-in-law when the lump of meat approached her lips. After spitting it out, she'd snatched up the fruit knife and glared fiercely at each of her family in turn, her terrified eyes rolling like those of a cornered animal. Once the blood was gushing out of her wrist, he'd torn a strip from one of their quilts, bound it around her wrist, and picked her up. Her body so light she could almost have been a ghost. As he ran down to the car park, he'd been surprised by the speed and decisiveness of his own actions, something he'd never before realized he was capable of. As he watched her unconscious form receive emergency medical treatment, he'd heard a sound like something snapping inside his own body. The feeling he'd had at that moment was one that, even now, he found himself unable to explain with any degree of accuracy. A person had attacked her own body right in front of his eyes, tried to hack at it like it was a piece of meat. Her blood had soaked his white shirt, mingling with his sweat and gradually drying to a dark brown stain. He remembered hoping she would survive, but at the same time doubting just what that survival would mean. The moment she'd tried to take her own life had been a turning point. Now there was nothing anyone could do to help her. Every single one of them, her parents who had force-fed her meat, her husband and siblings who had stood by and let it happen, were distant strangers, if not actual enemies. If she woke up again, that situation wouldn't have changed. Just because this suicide attempt had been spur of the moment didn't mean she wouldn't try it again. And if she did, no doubt. she'd be more careful in how she went about it, and that meant there mightn't be anyone to stop her, as there had been this time. All of a sudden, he became aware of the conclusion his thoughts had led him to, that it would be better if she didn't wake up, that if she did, the situation would actually be ambiguous, ghastly, that perhaps he ought to throw her out of the window while her eyes were still closed. Once she was out of danger, he'd used the money her husband had given him to go to a shop and buy a new shirt to change into. Instead of throwing away his soiled shirt, which stank of blood, he'd bundled it up into a ball and taken it with him in the taxi home. During the journey, his most recent video work had come to mind, and he'd been surprised to find himself recalling it as something that had caused him unbearable pain. The work was based around images related to things he loathed and thought of as lies, edited together into an impressionistic montage with music and graphic subtitles. Ads, clips from the news and television dramas, politicians' faces, ruined bridges and department stores, vagrants, and the tears of children who suffered from incurable diseases. He had felt suddenly sick. Even though those images had undeniably caused him agony, even though he'd hated them, the individual moments contained in the work, which he'd stayed up all night wrestling with, struggling to face up to the true nature of the emotions they provoked in him, had now come to feel like a form of violence. At that moment, his thoughts crossed a boundary, and he wanted to fling open the door of the speeding taxi and tumble out onto the tarmac. He could no longer bear the thought of those images, of the reality they portrayed. Back then, when he had been able to deal with them, it must have been because his hatred of them was somehow underdeveloped, or else because he hadn't been sufficiently threatened by them. But just then, shut up inside the taxi that sweltering summer afternoon with the smell of his sister-in-law's blood assailing his nostrils, those images and that reality were suddenly threatening, making the bile rise in his throat and the breath catch in his lungs. It occurred to him that it might be a long time before he was capable of making another work. He was worn out, and life revolted him. He couldn't cope with all these things it contaminated. The past 10 or so years' worth of work was quietly turning its back on him. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to a person he used to know, or thought he'd known. Once upon a time. His sister-in-law was silent on the other end of the phone. He knew she was there, though. He could hear a faint sighing sound, like breathing, overlaid with a kind of rattling that he guessed was coming from the line. Hello? He was finding it difficult to force the words out. Sister-in-law, it's me. Jiwoo's mum is... He despised himself, all his hypocrisy and trickery, but fought this down and continued speaking. Well, she's worried, you know. Still no answer. He sighed into the receiver. She would be standing there barefoot. He knew, like always. When her time at the psychiatric hospital, where she'd spent several months, had come to a close, she'd come to stay with them while his wife and the rest of the family all went to try to persuade her husband to take her back. The month she'd spent with them, before moving out into a rented studio apartment, had caused none of them even the slightest strain. Partly this was because he had yet to hear about the Mongolian mark, and thus regarded her as nothing more than an object of pity, albeit a faintly inscrutable one. She'd never been much of a talker, and had spent the majority of her time out on their veranda, sunning herself in the late autumn sunshine. She would occupy herself in picking up the dried leaves that had fallen from the flower pots and crumbling them into a fine powder, or in stretching out the palm of her hand to cast shadows over the floor. When his wife was busy with something, she would lend a hand with Ji-woo, taking him to the bathroom and helping him wash, her bare feet kissing the cold tiles. It was difficult to believe that such a woman had once tried to kill herself, or that she'd sat topless in front of a crowd of strangers, perfectly composed, which had apparently been a symptom of some kind of post-suicide attempt dementia. That he had run to the hospital with her bleeding on his back, and that the experience had had such a profound effect on him, seemed like something that had happened with a different woman, or perhaps in a different time. The only thing that was especially unusual about her was that she didn't eat meat. This had been a source of friction with her family from the start, and since her behavior after this initial change had grown increasingly strange, culminating in her wandering around topless, her husband had decided that her vegetarianism was proof that she would never be normal again. She was always so submissive, outwardly at any rate, and for a woman who wasn't quite all there to start with to be taking medication every day, well, she's bound to get worse, and that's all there is to it. What threw him was the way that his brother-in-law seemed to consider it perfectly natural to discard his wife as though she were a broken watch or household appliance. Now, don't go making me out to be some kind of villain. Anyone can see that I'm the real victim here. Unable to deny that there was at least a measure of truth in this, he, unlike his wife, kept a neutral position on the matter. She, on the other hand, begged Mr. Chung to hold off on the formal divorce proceedings and wait to see how things would pan out, but he remained unmoved. He made an effort to push Mr. Chung's face out of his mind, that narrow forehead, pointed jaw, and general look of stubbornness which he'd always found unpleasant. He tried speaking Yeong-hye's name again. "Answer me, sister-in-law. Whatever you say, just answer." Just as he thought there was nothing else for it but to hang up, she spoke. The water's boiling. Her voice had no weight to it, like feathers. It was neither gloomy nor absent-minded, as might be expected of someone who was ill, but it wasn't bright or light-hearted either. It was the quiet tone of a person who didn't belong anywhere, someone who had passed into a border area between states of being. "I'll have to go and turn it off." "Sister-in-law." He spoke hurriedly, panicking that she might put the phone down and cut him off. "Is it okay if I come over now? You aren't going out anywhere today?" After a brief silence, he heard a click and the tone which signaled that the call had been ended. He put down the phone, his hands slick with sweat. It was clearly only after hearing about her Mongolian mark from his wife that he'd started to see his sister-in-law in a new light. Before that, he'd never had any kind of ulterior motive when it came to his dealings with her. When he recalled how she'd looked and acted during the time she'd spent living with them, the sexual desire that flooded through him was a product of his mental reenactment of these past experiences, not something he'd actually felt at the time. He felt his skin grow heated every time he called to mind her absent-minded expression as she sat on the veranda throwing out shadows with her hand. The flash of white ankle that her baggy tracksuit bottoms had revealed while she was helping his son to wash. The nonchalant line of her body as she'd sat sprawled in front of the television. Her half-naked legs, her disheveled hair. And stamped over all these memories was the blue Mongolian mark. That mark which appeared on the buttocks or backs of children, usually fading away long before adulthood. Now, the fact that she didn't eat meat, only vegetables and cereal grains, seemed to fit with the image of that blue petal-like mark, so much so that the one could not be disentangled from the other. And the fact that the blood that had gushed out of her artery had soaked his white shirt, drying into the dark, matte burgundy of red bean soup, felt like a shocking, indecipherable premonition of his own eventual fate. Her room was in a fairly quiet alley near to a women's university. He stood in front of the multi-story building, laden down with 2 big bags of fruit that his wife had insisted he bring with him. Tangerines, pears, and apples from Jeju Island, and even some out-of-season strawberries. The knotted muscles in his hands and arms ached, but still he stood there wavering, realizing as he did that the thought of going up to her apartment, of encountering her in person, was making him afraid. At last he set the fruit down, flipped open his mobile, and dialed her number. When she still hadn't answered after the 10th ring, he picked the fruit up again and began to climb the stairs. When he reached the 3rd floor, he went over to the corner apartment and pressed the doorbell, which had a picture of a semi-quaver. Just as he'd thought, no answer. He tried turning the handle. To his surprise, the door opened. He readjusted his baseball cap, only then realizing that his hair was soaked with sweat, tidied himself up a bit, took a deep breath, and pushed the door. The south-facing studio apartment was bathed in the early October sunlight as far in as the kitchen area, and felt still. Some of his wife's clothes, which she'd passed on to her sister, were lying scattered across the floor, and there were tiny dust balls rolling about, but somehow the place managed not to seem untidy. Perhaps that was because of the almost complete lack of furniture. After putting the fruit down next to the door, he took off his shoes and went in. There was no sign of her anywhere. Perhaps she'd gone out. Perhaps she'd gone out deliberately because he'd told her he was coming. There was no television, and there was something unseemly about the way the 2 wall sockets, next to the hole for an antenna, lay exposed in the middle of the wall. At the far end of the living room, cum bedroom, where his wife had installed a solitary telephone, there was a mattress, on top of which the quilt was rumpled up into a cave-like mound, as though someone had just slid out from under it. The air felt stale, and he was on the point of opening the door to the veranda when he heard a noise and whipped around. The breath caught in his throat. She was coming out of the bathroom. The real shock, though, was that she was naked. She stood there blankly for a moment, as though she too were somewhat startled and without the slightest trace of moisture visible on her naked body. But then she began to pick up the scattered clothes one by one and slip them on. She did this quite calmly, not in the least flustered or embarrassed, as though getting dressed were merely something demanded by the situation, rather than something she herself felt to be necessary. While she stood there getting dressed, calmly and methodically, and without turning her back to him, he was of course aware that he should either avert his gaze or hurry outside, and yet he remained standing there as if rooted to the spot. She wasn't as gaunt as when she'd initially turned vegetarian. She'd gradually put on weight after being admitted to the hospital, and she'd eaten well when she'd been staying with him and his wife, thanks to which her breasts had now rounded out into softness. Her waist narrowed sharply, her body hair was fairly sparse, and the overall effect, aside from the line of her thigh, which he felt could have done with being a little rounder, was one of an enticing lack of superfluity. Rather than provoking lust, it was a body that made one want to rest one's gaze quietly upon it. Once she'd finished sorting through the clothes and putting them on, she came up to him, and it occurred to him that he hadn't managed to get a look at her Mongolian mark. "I'm sorry." Belatedly, he stammered his excuse. "What with the door being open, I thought you'd just popped out for something or other." "It's okay." Now, too, she spoke as though answering like this was the expected, necessary thing. "It's just that I enjoy being like this when I'm on my own." So, he tried to collect his thoughts. His mind had gone blank. She's saying that she always walks around with her clothes off in the house. He'd been fine just a moment ago when confronted with her naked body, but as soon as he grasped what she was saying, he became flustered and felt his penis becoming engorged. He took off his baseball cap and squatted down awkwardly, trying to conceal his erection. I've nothing to offer you to eat. She walked over to the kitchen area, and he took in the fact that her light gray tracksuit bottoms were grazing her bare skin, knowing from what he'd just seen that she wasn't wearing anything underneath. Her buttocks were neither large nor particularly voluptuous, nothing to account for why his mouth was suddenly so dry. I'm not really hungry, he said, stalling for time in the hope he'd be able to suppress his arousal. How about we just eat some of this fruit? If you like. She went over to the front door, picked up the pears and apples, and carried them to the sink. Listening to the sound of running water and the clinking of dishes, he tried to concentrate on the ugly electrical sockets and the angular telephone buttons, but the memory of her pubic region only intensified in his mind. His head throbbed with the image of her buttocks crowded with colored petals, overlying that of the man and woman having sex, with which he'd covered page after page of his sketchbook. When she came and sat down next to him, carrying plates of the peeled, sliced fruit, he had to bow his head so that she wouldn't see the look in his eyes. I don't know if the apples will be any good, he trailed off. After a while, she broke the silence. You know, you don't have to come and visit me. Oh? The doctor said I wasn't to do any kind of job where I would be left alone with my own thoughts, she continued in a low voice, so I'm thinking of trying somewhere like a department store. I even had an interview last week. Really? This was surprising. Would you be able to put up with a wife who was always like that, zoned out on psychiatric medication every day, completely dependent on you for her livelihood? This was something Mr. Chung had said to him during one of their phone calls, slurring as if he were drunk. Now it turned out that prediction had been off. She wasn't as far gone as all that. Turning his upper body toward her, though with his eyes still fixed on the ground, he finally got to the point. How about working at your sister's store instead? As he carried on talking, he felt his arousal subside a little. Jiwoo's mom pays a decent wage, you know what a good person she is, and she'd much rather see it go to you than to a stranger. She's your sister, which means you can trust each other, and she'd like for the two of you to spend more time together. Besides, the work wouldn't be as tough as at a department store. Slowly she turned to face him, and he saw that her expression was as serene as that of a Buddhist monk. Such uncanny serenity actually frightened him, making him think that perhaps this was a surface impression left behind after any amount of unspeakable viciousness had been digested, or else settled down inside her as a kind of sediment. He reproached himself for having used her as a kind of mental pornography when she simply had an innocent wish to be naked. All the same, he was unable to deny that the image of her naked was now stamped indelibly on his brain, burned into him like a brand. Have some pear. She held the plate out to him. You have some too. Using her fingers instead of a fork, she picked up a piece of pear and put it in her mouth. He averted his head. Frightened by the sudden urge, he had to throw his arms around her still form. So still, in fact, she appeared to be lost in thought. To suck on her index finger, sticky with sweet pear juice, and lick the last of the juice from her lips and tongue, and to pull her baggy tracksuit bottoms down right then and there.